which we are a supporter, is an alternative standpoint, debate between theory of mind, simulation theory. The difference between enactive and theory of theory is rather obvious. But at the opposite, there is a close correlation with the simulation theory, especially with the idea developed by Gallager of the embodied simulation. What are the points of contact, and what are the difference between these two approaches?
Okay. Yes. Vittorio Gallager and I have conversations about this often, and we seem to agree on about 90% of what, of the ideas that we share. I would say about 90%, rather than the full 100%. So the 10% difference, perhaps, is over this notion of simulation. And for him, when he talks about the mirror system, he thinks of it as a form of simulation. And that seems to me to mean one of several things. Part of the problem is the simulation theory has different conceptions of what simulation means. So on a very traditional view of simulation, it seems to mean something that involves pretense, or a kind of instrumental control over the process that I'm engaged in. And Gallager says, no, that's not what he means by simulation. Many times, someone like Alvin Goldman, another philosopher, thinks that simulation is a kind of matching. So if my system is in exactly the same state that your system is in, there's a kind of match between our systems, then that's sufficient for us to talk about simulation. Gallager here also says, well, he doesn't really think that's the case. So if we ask Gallager, what does he mean by simulation? His most recent answer is that it's a kind of reuse of a certain motor control system that I have. I use that in a way to, here I think it's difficult to say, but the way I understand it is I use this in a certain way to put my system into a similar state to yours. So again, we're back to a matching. So if that's right, the enactive theory disagrees with simulation in this idea that our systems have to be in a similar state, or that there has to be any kind of matching going on. The enactive view is that my system is in a state of response to your system, but it's not a matching response. It's not that I'm in the same state that you're in. It's not that I'm simulating or trying to match your state. It's rather I'm trying to respond to your action. Right? So what the mirror system is doing on the enactive interpretation is that the mirror system is preparing or entering into a state of response that is not necessarily a simulation or a matching state. So what my response to your action would be not simply to mimic or imitate your action necessarily, but it would be to respond in a way that complements or that is a logical response to yours.
Thank you. How does the interactive theories answer to the question still resolved in the debate between theory of theory and simulation theory about the innate or acquired character of human capacity to mentalize the emotional state of the other mind?
Okay, so the inactive, or maybe I think interactive approach to social cognition or intersubjectivity, I think doesn't have a strong position, for example, on certain things being innate. There may be certain aspects of our behavior or of the system that certain aspects that are innate, but that that doesn't rule out the fact or the idea that there could be some development also, that we acquire certain aspects of our abilities for interaction as we grow and mature. And in fact, I think this kind of interactive or inactive theory would in fact say that we acquire quite a bit as we go. And if you look at some of the things that are emphasized in things like secondary intersubjectivity, then it makes sense to think that, yeah, there's quite a bit of learning going on in the young infant. And the young infant adopts various aspects of the capacity to interact with others. So this contrasts, I think, very clearly with those versions of theory that argue for an innate module that simply, turns on at a certain point in development, and it wouldn't necessarily contradict the idea that perhaps there is something like an innate predisposition for the kind of activity involved in a mirror system. Yeah. So, in other words, so the answer is that I guess the position that I would defend, allows for certain aspects to be innate, but also allows for quite a bit of it to be a matter of acquisition and development.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Question about empathy. Empathy is a phenomenon that allows humans to mind read the mental state of the other. It is a process of simulation which is activated in the encounter with the other. Nevertheless, it is unclear both if it is an automatic process that always occurs in the interaction with the other, and if it does, and if it depends on precondition and knowledge of the other people. What do you think about
empathy? So there's a big discussion, ongoing debate about empathy. So the way you defined it, I don't know if I would agree with that definition. So there are some who would argue that empathy is not equivalent to mind reading. In fact, someone like Pierre Jacob in Paris or Frédéric Devenon would argue, in fact, that there has to be a very clear distinction between ordinary mind reading and something like empathy. And I tend to agree with them on that point, although I don't necessarily agree on their theory as they develop it. You also suggested that empathy is a form of simulation, and I don't necessarily agree with that either. So, again, Jacob and Devenon would say that empathy depends on a higher order type of process. It's not automatic. It's not a form of mind reading, but it is a form of simulation. And it involves putting oneself into a similar emotional state, matching up your emotional state with the other person. And in that respect is a form of simulation. That's the part I disagree with. So I would say it's not automatic, it's not a form of mind reading, but also that it doesn't depend on a simulation process, that one's emotional state in the case of empathy does not have to match the state of the other person. But that it is something more like a high order process. And for me, it involves something like narrative. So I would say I have a narrative theory of empathy rather than a simulation theory. And that really involves an attempt to understand the context of the other person. So this is a version, or a conception of empathy, a higher order conception of empathy, that says understanding is involved in the process. In contrast to a low-level, automatic type of process that could occur in every case. So, for example, Vittorio Gallager, and also some phenomenologists like Dan Zahavi, would defend the idea that empathy is really the name of this kind of low-level process that happens automatically every time we confront another person or meet or encounter another person. For Gallager, it's the mirror neurons that are firing, and once that happens, that's what he calls empathy. And for Zahavi, it's a kind of immediate perception of the other person that is an empathic response to the other person. These are very low-level processes. And maybe the very original term empathy signified something like that, but I think in our normal usage today, when we talk about empathy, it's not something that signifies something automatic happening in each case, but rather some of them are perceivable, some of them are right there, embodied in the other person, such as certain facial expressions, where when you say something like facial expression, that doesn't mean that it expresses something that's internal, that is the emotion, but rather that the emotion is, at least in part, that facial expression, that bodily response, and that can be seen. Right? But emotion is also, also consists of these other things that may not be seen. So a phenomenal sense, a feeling, some kind of bodily response that is not necessarily there on the surface, but is felt. And to some extent, I think, and this is very much consistent with someone like John Dewey, who argues that an emotion also involves a situational aspect, that what in part constitutes emotion is the situation. And that goes along with the phenomenological idea that emotions are intentional, that they are directed towards the world in a certain fashion. That if we are experiencing fear, it's fear of something. So it turns out that something also may be very much perceivable, might be part of the world, part of the environment that the person is in. So if I see another person in a certain environment with a certain facial expression, with eyes directed at a certain part of the environment, for example, then there are visible things that I can see there that are part of, not the full emotion, but are part of the emotion. And that allows me to see enough of the emotion to be able to say what it is. So I think, emotions can be directly perceived, and that doesn't mean that I see every aspect of the emotion. There may be other aspects of the emotion that are not perceivable. But as long as I see enough of the pattern, as long as enough of the pattern is visible, so to speak, then this type of direct perception is something like pattern recognition. It's a way of picking up certain aspects of the other person's behavior, which actually constitute the emotion.
The disorder of the body representation concern a disease in what you have called body schema, that is different from body image. The body schema involves the body as a whole and concern pathologies like anarchic hand. Could the use of immersive virtual reality system, that is a simulation system, be an help in order to reconfigure the own body schema?
I think so, and I think it's been done, in fact. So, someone I've worked with in this regard is Jonathan Cole, who's a British neurophysiologist, clinical neurophysiologist who works with patients who have difficulties and problems, specifically with their body schema. So he had a research program several years ago where he used virtual reality as a way to address phantom limb pain, specifically. But in the process of addressing the pain, what was involved was the person had to but had to say, this is a little difficult to explain. So what was going on was the patient was wearing virtual goggles, and what they saw was let's say, a representation of their hand, the hand that was missing. And they were able to manipulate the hand, right, in order to do a certain task. So that allowed them to operate the phantom, so to speak, in such a way that it relieved part of the pain. So in that respect, what did that do? That, in some sense, established some body schematic control over the missing limb, right? So it reconfigured the body schema, right, through the use of virtual reality in order to address a problem that the patient was having. So it seems to me that, at least in that case, you had an instance of the use of virtual reality to modulate the body schematic process in a patient.
Yeah, exactly. You have carried out a lot of experiments in which are analyzed different types of psychopathology and neural disease. Often robotics devices and virtual reality technologies are useful tools to improve or to treat these pathologies. In some cases, it also was used to discover novel knowledge about the pathologies. Have you never used these perceptual technologies with this goal?
Have I used them?
Yeah.
Myself.
No, on yourself. In your
not on myself,
yeah.
but in experiments.
For your research.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've known people to use them,
Okay.
right? But I've not used them myself.
Are you interested in use it in the future?
Sure. I mean, so the question is whether I would be interested in using virtual reality technology.
Or robotics device to discover novel knowledge, or to treat or to support the person that has these pathologies.
Yes, I think the answer to that is yes. So, for example, that experiment I did on using simulations in the computer sense of simulations, right? Simulated environments to study, to replicate those kinds of experiences that astronauts have in space. So I was talking about that yesterday here in the conference.
It was interesting talk.
Yeah. So one idea we have is that we might be able to use such virtual environments and the replication of such experiences of awe and wonder to address things like depression or to use in sort of therapeutic or clinical settings that would address some other types of traumatic stress, or, that type of condition. So I suppose that would count for, an example of what you're mentioning, right? Where in a kind of clinical setting, using virtual reality, I think that's a very interesting and I think maybe promising field of research. So I definitely would be interested, and maybe someday that will happen.
Okay. Another question. Your research is strongly related with cognitive science. In fact, you are co-author with Gallager of a famous book, The Phenomenological Mind.
Right.
And what is the relationship between phenomenology and cognitive science? How can the phenomenological approach stay together with the reductionism of the cognitive science?
Well, I think one of the interesting ideas of using phenomenology to engage with people who are doing cognitive science is that we might be able to arrive at a non-reductionist cognitive science. So what this means is that some kind of change of understanding has to happen, perhaps on both sides of that relationship. So phenomenologists sometimes want to object to the idea that phenomenology could be used in the service or could interact with people working in cognitive science, because phenomenology is a transcendental enterprise, right? And it's not supposed to be something that is involved in empirical investigation. So if phenomenology is going to, if phenomenologists are going to enter into some kind of cooperative investigation with cognitive science, then maybe phenomenology has to change, or at least exploit certain aspects of its approach, the type of thing that Merleau-Ponty, I think, did very well to address certain empirical issues. But on the other side, to the extent that cognitive science is open to what phenomenology has to offer, I think that cognitive science also has to change its understanding, perhaps even of what nature is, what a naturalistic explanation looks like. So that a naturalistic explanation of human behavior and cognition and consciousness is not necessarily going to be a reductive explanation, where we simply translate all kinds of complex phenomena into neuronal states or something like that. So I think what phenomenology brings to cognitive science is the possibility of developing an explanation that goes beyond a reductionistic explanation, that opens up all kinds of issues that might be addressed in a way that goes beyond the notion that we can get a reductive explanation in terms of neuronal activations and things like that. So in that sense, an embodied and an active, emphasizing the importance of the environment, both the physical and the social environment, expanding the scope of what we might think the explanation would look like in contrast to a reductionist approach.
In the world of philosophical research, there is a split between two approaches. On one end, the conservative approach, which is closed in itself and self-referential. On the other end, an open approach, by which the philosophy measures constantly itself with the other science. Are you a supporter of the latter approach? Engaging you say yes.
Yes.
And if yes, what are the boundaries between these disciplines, and what is the role of philosophy in front of the other applied science?
Okay, well, I think that when you look back into the history of philosophy, you find a very rich kind of disciplinary, but even, I would say, also interdisciplinary type of process that had been called philosophy, and from which the sciences themselves developed. First, the natural sciences, right? If you go way back to the ancient times, what was philosophy? Philosophy included the, physics, right? Not only metaphysics, but physics, as well. And mathematics was closely associated with philosophy. So all of knowledge, philosophy encompassed all of knowledge. And then as the sciences sort of emerged with their own methods and subject matters and kind of defined themselves, they split off from this general philosophical approach. And you find the same kind of evolution of the social sciences and behavioral sciences in, say, the 19th century or 18th, 19th century. So if you go back to, say, the 17th century and look at figures like Descartes, John Locke, Isaac Newton, are they philosophers or are they scientists? Well, really, they're both. They're fulfilling both kinds of roles. And it's hard to say, is this philosophy? It used to be called natural philosophy, experimental science. Only, I think, in around the 20th century did we kind of get this narrowing, specific definition of what philosophy is in contrast to the sciences. And part of that has to do with the reorganization of universities. There's sort of this historical and cultural reasons for it. But in fact, when it came to defining philosophy and putting it into a university department, and the philosophers were told, go do philosophy, as other people are going to do physics and chemistry and biology and so forth. Only then do you get this kind of pulling away from the sciences. So I think in the last maybe 50 years, there has been a change in some areas. A good example of that is where philosophy of mind, but also phenomenology, why not, comes into contact with cognitive science and sometimes can be regarded as part of cognitive science. So the idea that philosophy can work with the sciences and can be very interdisciplinary, I think is a good thing, and not a new thing, but it's actually going back to an older conception of what philosophy is.
Exactly. In your study, there is a strong interaction between different areas of research. Philosophy, as you said, philosophy always discussed with neuroscience, psychology also, and so on. What is the research methodology that you carried out during the experiments on the research in which there is a strong correlation between the areas?
What
is your methodology? What is your approach to the other science? Usually I make this. I ask this thing to all the person that I interview because it's my personal issue, because I work with some technologies and technologists, and then I need to research a method to interact with him in terms of research methodology.
Right. So, I mean, one of the standard
responses to that is something like, well, philosophers do conceptual analysis. And so scientists use concepts in their work in order to understand what they're studying, and even in order to design experiments. So philosophers can help science by analyzing and by clarifying certain concepts and making them much clearer and more precise. And so when you have a precise concept, that helps the scientist design better experiments and things like that. So that's a kind of general answer, I think. As a phenomenologist, I think the idea of using phenomenology not only for clarifying concepts, but for generating concepts, for offering ideas and distinctions based on a phenomenological analysis, let's say, can help scientists, sometimes at least, can help scientists design experiments. And I've had experience working with scientists where just in conversations, offering certain concepts or clarifications from a phenomenological perspective became then the basis for the scientists going a little bit further in their work and designing a different kind of experiment. So I sometimes refer to this as front-loaded phenomenology. So in phenomenological mind, I think we talk about this as well. So this is an approach that I think can be useful for science. And oftentimes, however, it's a two-way street, right? It's a phenomenologist perhaps offering a certain set of distinctions or concepts that then the scientists take, maybe design an experiment around, and then find out that those distinctions or concepts can be revised or made more precise themselves through the scientific experiment, or can be confirmed or disconfirmed even by the experiment. So phenomenologists can learn as much from the scientists as the scientists can learn from the phenomenologists.
Yeah.